Ancient Egypt, one of history's greatest civilizations. It was said to be built on the backs of thousands, whipped into submission by the all-powerful godlike pharaoh. But was that really true? What if life for Egypt's laborers wasn't exactly what you've been taught? Today on the Infographic Show, we're finding out what a day in the life of an Egyptian slave was really like. Everyone's heard plenty of myths about slavery in ancient Egypt, from the idea that slaves built the pyramids to the story where Moses freed them all with 12 scary plagues. But the story is more complicated and somehow even a little weirder than that. It had plenty more little intricacies than the transatlantic slave trade, where kidnapped Africans were forced into servitude in Europe and the Americas. Though, as you'll find out later, they are actually connected in a way you would never expect. Back in the land of the pharaohs, there were 3 different kinds of slaves. The quality of life you'd get to live all depended on which of these 3 categories you fell into. First, the worst, chattel slavery. This is the form of slavery you're probably most familiar with, where a person's rights are stripped away and they are treated as the property of another. In ancient Egypt, the chattel slaves were generally prisoners of war from conquered regions, both soldiers and civilians. All of these slaves were considered the personal property of the pharaoh, moved across Egypt wherever extra labor was needed. They could also be given by the pharaoh as gifts to important people, like his viziers or political advisors or nobles in his court. The Harris Papyrus recorded Ramses III even boasting about how many people he had captured on his conquests, and would now be forced to serve his mighty whims. I brought back in great numbers, with their hands tied behind their backs before my horses, and their wives and children in tens of thousands, branded and enslaved, tattooed with my name. King Sneferu is another pharaoh who has extensive records of taking slaves as spoils of war, which he did in 3 separate military campaigns into Libya, Nubia, and Sinai. For Egypt's rulers, owning and being served by slaves was such a normal part of life that it didn't even end with death. The tombs of pharaohs were lined with shabti, enchanted dolls made in the likeness of servants, meant to come to life in the field of reeds and serve their masters for eternity. But chattel slaves weren't limited to people captured by the pharaoh's armies at war. Ancient Egypt, one of the world's oldest civilizations, was constantly expanding beyond the banks of the Nile, and that meant an endless demand for labor to fuel their ambitious construction projects. To fill the void, the pharaohs were extremely loyal customers to a number of Mediterranean slave markets, where the slavers sold political prisoners captured in foreign wars. As far as the pharaohs were concerned, these people had forfeited their rights to personhood when they were captured. And when your people think you're a living god, you can get away with pretty much anything. The chattel slaves of ancient Egypt were basically public property. They had the rawest deal of anyone with a forced labor gig back in the time of kings. Not only were they treated the worst, being foreigners in a pretty nationalistic land, they also had the fewest means of ending their contract. And if you were born to enslaved parents, your fate was sealed from birth. You were automatically the property of the pharaoh and put to work as soon as you were strong enough to hold a hammer. There was basically only one way for a chattel slave to break their slavery, outside of literally dying or trying to escape the country in the dark of night. And that way was to serve in the ancient Egyptian military. While it definitely wasn't a sure thing, if you served with valor and loyalty, you had a chance of being allowed to return to your homeland, a reward for your service to the pharaoh. These prisoners of war were the first type of slaves used in ancient Egypt, dating back to the Old Kingdom, a 500-year period between 2613 and 2181 BCE. There was one more way to become a chattel slave: by committing a crime serious enough to be punished with hard labor. Most of the time, this would range for a few months to a few years. But if you really messed up, you might lose your freedom for the rest of your life. Things get a little more complicated when you flash forward to the first intermediate period of Egypt, which ran from 2181 to 2040 BCE. It was a chaotic time. Egypt was split into 2 different kingdoms, that of Waset in Upper Egypt and Het-Nuset in Lower Egypt. It also is where we meet our second form of slavery, bonded servants. Laws were introduced in this period that helped people settle debts. Say you are in deep with a local ancient Egyptian loan shark, or you paid your buddy and you just haven't been able to pay him back. In this period of ancient Egypt and beyond, you could settle this debt by selling off yourself or a family member, usually your wife or kids, into bonded labor. A contract would be drawn up, and you or a loved one would be a servant for your creditor for an agreed-upon amount of time in order to wipe your debt slate clean. By all accounts, this became a pretty popular system for settling disputes where money was concerned. And it wasn't even money all the time. There's one record of a man being forced into slavery for failing to return a set of bronze tools he had borrowed. Blockbuster might still be around if they took punishments that seriously for late DVD returns. Sometimes peasants who otherwise wouldn't have the money for food or shelter would sell themselves into slavery so they could live under their master's roof and eat his food. Thanks to some of the societal protections that the pharaoh placed on slaves, ancient Egyptian slavery was a preferable state for some than ancient Egyptian poverty. We'll get into the rights and protections of slaves later. It was during ancient Egypt's Middle Kingdom from 2040 to 1782 BCE that slaves from Asia became increasingly popular across all levels of Egyptian society. They worked as, among other things, servants, hairdressers, field workers, cobblers, gardeners, and weavers. By the Second Intermediate Period, a few centuries later, slaves had a full path to Egyptian citizenship. According to Egyptologist Dr. Andrei Cvek, quote, "The economy for Egypt had never been based on slavery, as was the case in Rome. Forced laborers were not a homogeneous and cohesive social group." And that is an extremely important thing to understand about how slaves of all stripes were viewed by other Egyptians. Slaves were not inherently seen as some kind of lower caste. It was a transitory state that people could enter or leave under a different number of circumstances. According to Dr. Cvek, slaves quickly assimilated into the communities where they worked. They were permitted to own personal property and even were known to marry free Egyptians, sometimes using marriage as a way to gain their freedom entirely. There was no Egyptian equivalent of Jim Crow. In the end, everyone was equally low compared to the pharaoh, his nobles, and the high priests. This means slavery, for the most part, was small-scale rather than industrialized. Most Egyptian slaves would be servants around the home of wealthier masters, or assistants for local artisans and tradesmen, not in the large-scale agricultural systems that later defined places like ancient Rome or the American South. We really didn't see a lot more Western markers of slavery until the Ptolemaic period from 305 to 30 BC, and that's when Egypt was ruled by the Greeks and so incorporated a more Hellenistic view on slavery. The third form of slavery was conscription labor. In its simplest terms, think of it kind of like the draft, but for all kinds of labor, not just military service. This is called a corvée labor system, and it means that most of the time you'd just be living an average life as an ancient Egyptian peasant. However, if the pharaoh had a major project from mining to construction to quarrying and beyond, and lacked the manpower to complete it, the order would move down the chain. Then local officials would conscript their best men to get it done. It may seem a little unfair, but if it involved skilled enough work, you would get paid afterwards. It's a real gray area in terms of whether you could even call it slavery. Nobody conscripted under the corvée system had specific owners either. It was all just work for the good of the state, making it feel closer to communist Russia or China than what we would think of as a traditional slave system. Joining work at a temple was one way that the people left the slave lifestyle, allowing you to later declare a religious exemption when called to work. The process of going from a slave to a temple worker was known as being purified. Slaves were also given as powers of negotiation in some cases. Chattel and debt slaves were more likely to be just paid in food and board, but those lucky enough to actually make money could save and one day negotiate themselves out of their contract with their master. It was rare, but not completely off the table either. Another common method for leaving slave life, in a similar camp to marrying a free Egyptian citizen, was being adopted by one. This would make you a full citizen, but you would be expected to act as a true son to your adoptive parents, honoring them in every way Egyptian society demanded. Most dealings with slaves happened behind closed doors, not in the more theatrical open-air slave auctions as seen in the American version of slavery. The sale of slaves would be done in front of a court or local political officials with an approved-upon contract. The only person who could bypass this was the pharaoh himself, who could basically do whatever he wanted. There really weren't many restrictions on those guys in ancient Egyptian society. But being a slave in ancient Egypt was not some basket full of roses. At times, it could be every bit as horrifying as anything you would expect when thinking about the dark historical uses for forced labor. Slaves who attempted to escape their conditions could be put to death for punishment after they'd been recaptured, especially if their masters weren't feeling lenient at the time. If you'd been selected for forced labor and you decided to go on the run, then your whole family would suffer too. The duty of that labor would pass on to your next of kin. When the pharaoh wanted that extension on his palace, by Osiris, he is going to get it one way or another. And as you've probably already guessed, slaves who disrespected their masters or refused to work could probably expect a pretty vicious beating for their trouble. And even if your masters weren't punishing you, the work could often be pretty punishing in and of itself. There was no ancient Egyptian OSHA. If you were sent down into a quarry or into some mine or a dangerous construction job, you could not count on the idea that you could be safely returning. That being said, these dangers weren't actually exclusive to slaves, and few jobs were considered slave exclusive outside of household servants to the wealthy. Chances are, in any dangerous job that a slave is forced to do, there would be a bunch of paid workers experiencing those very same dangers. Though admittedly, danger money is definitely a better deal than danger with no money. Slavery in Egypt, or more accurately, the misunderstanding of it, can be traced back to the accounts of Napoleon Bonaparte. Those distorted ideas later became a kind of playbook for slave owners and traders in the American South during the 18th and 19th centuries. In fact, figures like Andrew Jackson and Chancellor William Harper became a little obsessed with the idea that a burgeoning America could become a kind of new ancient Egypt with a booming slave trade propping up agriculture and construction. They thought of the Mississippi River as a new Nile, famous for its fertile surrounding soil. And this is why they named a city in Tennessee Memphis after its counterpart in Egypt. Some of the most passionate defenders of the American slavery movement, like U.S. Senator Robert Barnwell Rhett and Georgia lawyer and politician Thomas R.R. Cobb, thought of ancient Egypt as the perfect model for the new America to follow, a nation of kings and hierarchy, where black slaves were being subjugated over a millennium before the birth of Christ. Of course, they were leaving out one key detail. Many Egyptian slaves were black because Egyptians themselves, especially those living along the Nile Valley, were Afro-Asiatic. Egypt was a pre-colonial African nation that often warred with neighboring civilizations. Its chattel slaves were black largely by geography, not by the racial hierarchies that defined the antebellum American South. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather the pyramids in the room. When you picture thousands of ancient Egyptian slaves toiling away, you don't imagine them building roads or markets. They are building the Great Pyramids of Giza. But did they? And if they didn't, who did? The short answer is no, but the longer answer is actually a lot more interesting. For starters, you really shouldn't feel bad about believing the myth that slaves built the pyramids, because it stretches back thousands of years. Two origin points include the writing of the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Seriously, his two main nicknames among contemporary historians are the Father of History and the Father of Lies, the latter of which is also a biblical nickname for the devil. Speaking of biblical, the other main source of the pyramid slave myth is the Old Testament, specifically the Book of Exodus. It wrongly claimed that enslaved Israelites built ancient Egypt's greatest monuments. This is patently false. The last pyramid ever built, the Pyramid of Ahmose, was completed roughly 3,500 years before the Israelites even existed, at least as far as historians can tell. Think about the pyramids for a second, the first of which was constructed around 4,700 years ago, only 300 years after the construction of Stonehenge. And Stonehenge looks like a last-minute school project compared to the pyramids. These are architectural marvels so impressive in their construction that even today people are claiming that aliens must have made them. And consider the context of their construction, too. These were the tombs of the ancient pharaohs. We mentioned earlier that the pharaohs were believed to be human incarnations of divinity on earth. The Egyptians thought the state of the body and complex funerary practices were crucial in making sure you made it to the afterlife with your soul intact. So why would the pharaoh put a task this important into the hands of anyone other than extremely skilled craftsmen and career construction crews? So that is exactly what they did. Each project was designed, planned, and overseen by retainers working for the pharaoh, and then carried out by large construction crews with extra labor conscripted from nearby villages. These workers were formed into groups of 25,000 that each worked in 3-month shifts. They were paid for their work too, a liberty that is decidedly not afforded to slaves. And it's not just that they were paid, they were actually treated extremely well, which again makes a lot of sense. The pharaoh was thinking about their immortal soul here. Archaeological evidence from the pyramid dig sites shows that workers were well fed, receiving prime cuts of meat and thousands of jars of bread to keep their energy up. They even slept in purpose-built dorms constructed around the site. On top of all of that, it would have been considered a great honor in Egyptian culture to have worked on a king's tomb. For some workers, it was even pretty fun. Near the burial chamber of Pharaoh Khufu, a group of workers left some subtle graffiti saying, "The Friends of Khufu Gang," which almost feels like it should have a hashtag in front of it. Some had even more colorful nicknames, like the ones who helped build the tomb for Pharaoh Menkaure, who signed their names as the Drunkards of Menkaure. The weirdness of ancient Egyptian slavery continues to fascinate us because there really are no simple answers here. In many ways, it shows how societal ideas around different concepts change and evolve over time. Sometimes being an ancient Egyptian slave is something you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. Other times, the guaranteed work and social safety net is something we can downright envy in our chaotic modern lives. Living as an Egyptian slave could be brutal, but that was just one part of a civilization full of mysteries. Watch 50 insane facts about ancient Egypt to uncover the wild truths behind the ancient world, or click on this video instead.